April 17, 1945. Pacific Ocean, 80 miles east of Okinawa. The temperature was 24 degrees Celsius and the sky was overcast when Lieutenant Commander Robert MacDonald sat in the radio room of HMCS Uganda and prepared to have a conversation with ships that didn't exist. MacDonald was 29 years old, the communications officer aboard the Canadian cruiser Uganda, and for the past 3 weeks he had been broadcasting fake radio traffic designed to convince Japanese intelligence that the Allied naval force off Okinawa was significantly larger than it actually was. He was creating phantom destroyers and phantom aircraft carriers out of radio frequencies and call signs. The Japanese were listening. The question was whether they believed what they heard. Robert MacDonald came from Halifax, Nova Scotia. His father operated a telegraph office on the Halifax waterfront. MacDonald grew up around maritime communications, learning Morse code at age 10, understanding radio propagation and frequency management before he understood trigonometry. He joined the Royal Canadian Navy in 1936 at age 20 and trained as a signals officer at the Naval College in Esquimalt, British Columbia. By 1945, he had been operating naval communications for 9 years and was considered one of the best signals officers in the RCN. He could identify ships by their radio operators' individual transmission patterns. He could estimate distances by signal strength variations. He could detect deception in enemy transmissions by analyzing message timing and frequency usage. Now, he was creating that same deception for Japanese intelligence to analyze. HMCS Uganda was a Crown Colony-class light cruiser, originally built for the Royal Navy as HMS Uganda. The ship was transferred to the Royal Canadian Navy in October 1944 and renamed HMCS Uganda. The cruiser displaced 8,800 tons, measured 169 meters long, and carried a crew of 730.
It was armed with 9 6-inch guns, 8 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, and various smaller weapons. Uganda was one of only 2 Canadian cruisers serving in the Pacific Theatre during World War II. The ship had joined the British Pacific Fleet in March 1945 and participated in operations supporting the invasion of Okinawa. The battle for Okinawa began on April 1, 1945. Allied forces landed on the island against heavy Japanese resistance. The invasion required extensive naval support, including bombardment, air cover, and supply protection. The Allied naval force was substantial, but not unlimited. Ships needed to rotate off station for resupply, maintenance, and crew rest. This created periodic gaps in naval coverage that Japanese forces might exploit. To prevent Japanese reconnaissance from detecting these gaps, Allied command developed a deception operation. Ships leaving station would maintain radio communications, suggesting they remained on station, while ships newly arrived would minimize radio communications to avoid revealing the actual force composition. MacDonald was assigned to implement this deception for the Canadian and some British vessels. His method was relatively simple, but required precise execution. Ships leaving the operational area continued broadcasting routine radio traffic using their normal call signs and frequencies. This traffic was transmitted from other ships remaining on station, creating the illusion that departing ships were still present. Simultaneously, newly arriving ships maintained radio silence or used call signs of ships supposedly still present. The result was radio traffic patterns suggesting continuous presence of vessels that were actually rotating off and on station. The technical implementation was more complex than the basic concept. Each ship had a characteristic radio signature based on equipment specifications, antenna configurations, and operator habits.
MacDonald needed to replicate these signatures accurately enough to deceive Japanese radio intelligence. He studied the transmission characteristics of ships in the task force. He catalogued each ship's typical message types, transmission schedules, frequency usage patterns, and operator fists. Then he created a schedule showing which ship would simulate which other ship's communications and when. Uganda's radio room became the coordination center for this deception. MacDonald and his team of 6 radio operators maintained communication schedules for phantom ships, broadcast routine messages using fake call signs, and coordinated with other vessels doing similar deception work. The radio operators worked in shifts, maintaining 24-hour coverage. They broadcast weather reports for ships that had left the operational area. They transmitted logistics requests from phantom vessels. They created routine administrative traffic, suggesting normal fleet operations when actual fleet composition was changing continuously. The deception required extraordinary attention to detail. Real naval communications include errors, corrections, repeated messages, and routine bureaucratic traffic. MacDonald's team had to include all of this in their phantom communications. They deliberately made small transmission errors and sent corrections. They broadcast boring administrative messages about fuel consumption and personnel matters. They created message traffic that sounded exactly like normal fleet operations because it included all the inefficiency and routine bureaucracy that characterized actual naval communications. By late April 1945, MacDonald's radio deception was running continuously. Uganda's radio room was broadcasting traffic for approximately 8 to 12 phantom ships at any given time. Some of these ships were real vessels that had rotated off-station for maintenance. Some were fictional vessels created entirely through radio traffic.
The Japanese were monitoring Allied communications continuously, using radio direction finding stations on Okinawa and nearby islands. The question was whether they could distinguish real ships from phantom ships based on radio traffic analysis. On April 28, 1945, MacDonald received indirect confirmation that the deception was working. Allied intelligence intercepted a Japanese radio transmission from Okinawa to naval headquarters describing the Allied naval force off the island. The transmission estimated Allied strength at approximately 40 to 45 capital ships, including carriers, battleships, and cruisers. The actual Allied strength at that moment was approximately 28 capital ships, with another 10 rotating off-station for maintenance. The Japanese estimate was inflated by approximately 50%. They were counting phantom ships as real ships, based on radio traffic analysis. MacDonald reported this intelligence to his commanding officer, Captain Rollo Maingi. Maingi was 44 years old and had commanded Uganda since its transfer to Canadian service. Maingi understood the strategic value of making Japanese forces believe Allied naval strength was larger than reality. If Japanese commanders thought they faced 45 ships instead of 28, they might be more cautious about committing their remaining naval forces to battle. Japanese naval power had been largely destroyed by 1945, but remaining forces could still inflict significant damage if deployed effectively. Convincing the Japanese that Allied forces were overwhelming might deter Japanese naval operations entirely. Maingi asked MacDonald if maintaining the deception indefinitely was feasible. MacDonald said yes, but with caveats. We can maintain radio deception as long as the Japanese don't conduct close reconnaissance that reveals actual ship positions. Radio traffic tells them ships are present. Visual reconnaissance would tell them ships are absent. So far, Japanese air reconnaissance has been limited by our fighter cover. If that changes, the deception fails. Maingi noted this and reported to Fleet Command that radio deception was working, but vulnerable to reconnaissance. The deception continued through May and into June 1945. Uganda rotated off-station twice during this period for resupply and returned each time to resume deception duties. MacDonald's radio team became extremely proficient at simulating multiple ships simultaneously. They could maintain consistent radio signatures for phantom vessels across weeks of operations. They developed shortcuts and templates that reduced the workload while maintaining deception quality. By June 1945, the radio deception had become routine enough that MacDonald could delegate most operations to his senior operators while he supervised and coordinated. On June 27, 1945, an unusual event occurred that tested the deception unexpectedly. Uganda's crew voted on whether to continue serving in the Pacific Theatre or return to Canada.
The RCN had instituted a policy allowing personnel who volunteered only for Atlantic service to decline Pacific deployment. Uganda's crew voted, and a majority voted to return to Canada rather than continue Pacific operations. This created a significant operational problem. Uganda was scheduled to remain on station off Okinawa until August. If the ship left immediately based on the crew vote, it would create a gap in Allied naval coverage and reveal the ship rotation that radio deception was supposed to conceal. Fleet Command decided Uganda would remain on station until July 10th to allow for replacement vessel deployment, then return to Canada. MacDonald's task was to maintain radio deception, suggesting Uganda remained on station even after the ship departed. This required coordinating with another vessel to continue broadcasting Uganda's radio traffic after the ship left the operational area. MacDonald chose HMS Swiftsure, a British cruiser with similar radio equipment, to assume Uganda's radio identity after departure. On July 10, 1945, Uganda departed the Okinawa operational area and began the voyage back to Canada. Simultaneously, Swiftsure began broadcasting radio traffic using Uganda's call sign and frequencies. The deception was seamless. Japanese radio intelligence monitoring Allied communications detected no change. Uganda appeared to remain on station based on radio traffic, even though the ship was sailing toward Pearl Harbor. The deception continued for 3 weeks until Uganda's departure was no longer operationally significant. Uganda reached Esquimalt, British Columbia, on August 10, 1945. 5 days later, on August 15th, Japan surrendered. The war ended before Uganda could be reassigned or its crew situation resolved. MacDonald remained aboard as communications officer during the ship's post-war service. Uganda was eventually decommissioned in 1947. MacDonald left the Navy and returned to Halifax. He got a job with Canadian National Telegraphs as a communications supervisor. He worked for the telegraph company for 32 years, retiring in 1977 at age 61. MacDonald never discussed the radio deception operations publicly. The operations remained classified until the late 1970s. In 1978, a naval historian named Dr. Thomas Wright was researching Canadian Pacific operations during World War II. Wright found references in declassified RCN documents to radio deception operations conducted by Uganda during the Okinawa campaign. The references were brief and provided few details. Wright tracked down MacDonald in Halifax and requested an interview. MacDonald was 62 years old. He agreed to meet. Wright asked MacDonald to describe the radio deception operations. MacDonald described them in technical terms: the frequency usage, the call sign rotation, the message types simulated, the coordination with other vessels. He described it the way a telegraph operator describes routing messages through switching networks. Wright asked if the deception had been difficult to maintain. MacDonald said no, it was technically straightforward. The difficulty wasn't technical. It was maintaining consistency across weeks of operations while rotating operators and coordinating with other ships. The deception worked because we were very careful about details. Wright asked if MacDonald knew the deception's strategic impact. MacDonald said he knew Japanese intelligence had estimated Allied naval strength higher than actual strength based on intercepted Japanese communications. Wright said post-war analysis suggested the overestimation may have deterred Japanese naval operations during the Okinawa campaign. MacDonald said he had suspected that, but never had confirmation. Wright asked if MacDonald felt proud of this contribution. MacDonald thought carefully. "I feel satisfied we did the job competently. Pride is probably too strong. We broadcast fake radio traffic successfully. That's all." Wright pointed out that successfully deceiving Japanese intelligence about Allied naval strength potentially saved lives by deterring Japanese attacks. MacDonald acknowledged this, but said he couldn't quantify the effect. Maybe the Japanese would have attacked anyway.
regardless of what they thought Allied strength was. Maybe the deception prevented attacks that would have occurred. I can't know. I just know we maintained the deception successfully. What the Japanese did with the false information is their decision. Wright asked if MacDonald ever worried the deception might be detected. MacDonald said constantly. Every time we broadcast, I worried Japanese analysts would notice something inconsistent, a wrong frequency, a message type that didn't match the ship we were simulating, an operator fist that sounded wrong. The deception worked because those inconsistencies never occurred or weren't noticed.
But the worry was always there. In 1982, a Japanese naval historian named Dr. Takeshi Yamamoto was researching Japanese intelligence operations during the Okinawa campaign. Yamamoto had access to declassified Japanese naval intelligence reports from 1945. These reports showed Japanese estimates of Allied naval strength off Okinawa from April through July 1945. The estimates consistently showed Allied strength 40 to 50% higher than actual Allied strength. Yamamoto noticed this discrepancy and wondered why Japanese intelligence had overestimated so significantly. Yamamoto found references in Japanese reports to Allied radio traffic analysis. Japanese radio direction finding stations had tracked Allied naval communications and plotted ship positions based on signal analysis. The positions were accurate. The ship counts were inflated. Yamamoto concluded that Allied forces had conducted radio deception operations, broadcasting traffic from ships that were not actually present. He wanted to confirm this from Allied sources. He contacted Wright, who provided information about MacDonald's radio deception operations aboard Uganda. Yamamoto wrote to MacDonald in 1983, asking if they could correspond about the deception from Japanese perspective. MacDonald agreed. They exchanged letters for 3 years. Yamamoto provided Japanese intelligence reports showing how they had analyzed Allied radio traffic and estimated fleet strength. MacDonald provided technical details about how the radio deception was implemented. Yamamoto asked if MacDonald had known Japanese intelligence was being deceived. MacDonald said yes. Allied command had intercepted Japanese communications, showing they believed phantom ships were real. Yamamoto asked if MacDonald felt the deception was fair warfare. MacDonald found the question strange. Deception is a normal tool of warfare. The Japanese used deception. We used deception. Both sides tried to mislead the other. I don't think fairness is relevant. We were trying to win. They were trying to win. Deception helped us. I don't need to feel guilty about using available tools. Yamamoto said he wasn't suggesting guilt, just wondering if Western military culture viewed deception differently than Japanese culture. MacDonald said he didn't know enough about Japanese culture to compare. I can only say that from my perspective, making the enemy think you're stronger than you are is good tactics. In 1986, Yamamoto traveled to Halifax to meet MacDonald. Yamamoto was 58 years old, a professor at Tokyo University. MacDonald was 70. They met at MacDonald's house and compared perspectives on the deception operation. Yamamoto brought copies of Japanese intelligence maps from 1945, showing estimated Allied ship positions off Okinawa. The maps showed Uganda positioned near Okinawa in July 1945, even though Uganda had left on July 10th. MacDonald looked at the map and saw the phantom presence his radio deception had created. We were halfway to Pearl Harbor when your intelligence placed us off Okinawa, MacDonald said. The radio deception worked perfectly. Yamamoto asked how long the deception could have been maintained if the war had continued. MacDonald said indefinitely, as long as Japanese reconnaissance didn't reveal actual ship positions. Radio deception works until someone verifies with visual observation. The Japanese couldn't conduct close reconnaissance because Allied air cover prevented it. Without reconnaissance, they had to trust radio analysis. We gave them consistent radio patterns that suggested more ships than were actually present. They believed it because it was technically correct. The technical analysis was sound. The data was fake. Yamamoto said this was the essential problem with intelligence work.
You can analyze data perfectly and still reach wrong conclusions if the data is deliberately false. They discussed whether Japanese commanders would have acted differently if they had known actual Allied naval strength was 28 ships instead of the estimated 45 ships. Yamamoto said probably not. By April 1945, Japanese naval power was almost completely destroyed. We had few ships remaining and limited fuel. Whether we faced 28 Allied ships or 45 Allied ships didn't change that we couldn't effectively oppose the invasion. The deception may have reinforced our caution, but it probably didn't change our strategic decisions significantly. MacDonald found this observation interesting. The deception had worked perfectly, but might not have changed Japanese behavior meaningfully. So we successfully convinced you we had more ships than we did, but it didn't matter because you couldn't do anything about it either way, MacDonald said. Yes, Yamamoto said. That's accurate. MacDonald asked what Yamamoto thought about the ethics of deception. Yamamoto said deception was normal in warfare. Both sides deceive. The side that deceives more effectively gains advantage. This is how warfare works. I don't find it troubling ethically. It's just tactics. MacDonald agreed. That's my perspective as well. We weren't lying to our own command. We were deceiving the enemy. That's what you're supposed to do in war. They corresponded until Yamamoto died in 1998 at age 70. MacDonald died in 2004 at age 88. His obituary in the Halifax Chronicle mentioned his long career with Canadian National Telegraphs and his naval service during World War II, but did not mention the radio deception operations. The obituary was brief and would not have indicated to readers that the deceased had convinced Japanese intelligence that Allied naval forces were 50% larger than actual strength. The lesson from MacDonald's story is not primarily about radio deception or signals intelligence.
It is about the relationship between technical execution and strategic effect. MacDonald successfully maintained radio deception for 4 months, convincing Japanese intelligence that Allied naval strength was significantly larger than reality. This deception was technically perfect. Japanese analysts couldn't detect it, but the strategic effect was possibly minimal because Japanese forces were too depleted to oppose Allied operations regardless of estimated Allied strength. This creates an interesting situation where perfect execution of deception may not have mattered operationally. MacDonald's radio deception worked. The Japanese believed it, but they might have made the same decisions without the deception because their strategic situation was hopeless regardless of Allied strength. Does this mean the deception was worthless? Not exactly. It confirmed Japanese caution and potentially prevented desperate attacks that might have occurred if Japanese commanders thought Allied forces were weaker. But the primary strategic factor was Japanese weakness rather than deception-induced Allied apparent strength. MacDonald understood this by 1986 when he met Yamamoto. The deception worked, but its impact was uncertain. MacDonald accepted this uncertainty without needing the deception to be decisively important. He had done his job competently. The radio traffic was believable. The Japanese believed it. Whether that belief changed their behavior significantly was a different question. MacDonald didn't need to prove his work was decisive to validate that the work was done well. This is a more modest assessment of contribution than dramatic claims about deception winning battles. MacDonald's radio deception was effective technical work that may or may not have changed strategic outcomes. The uncertainty doesn't diminish the work. It just acknowledges that warfare involves many factors, and isolating the effect of any single factor is difficult.
MacDonald broadcast fake radio traffic successfully for 4 months. That's what he was asked to do. Whether it changed Japanese decisions is unknowable. Sometimes good work has uncertain effects, and that's acceptable. The work was still good. The effects were still possible. Perfect certainty about cause and effect in warfare is rare. MacDonald did what was asked, did it well, and lived with the uncertainty about whether it mattered. That's often what contribution looks like.